She wore the dress he once called beautiful, stood in a ballroom blazing with candlelight, and waited for her husband to look at her. He never did. While the Duke of Ravensmere smiled at another woman, a real smile, the kind Arabella hadn't seen in months. She set down her champagne glass, still half full, walked through the doors, and disappeared into the October night without a single word of goodbye. In 2 years of marriage, she had never left before him. Tonight, she did. And by the time he turned around, her chair was already cold. If you've ever poured everything you had into a love that only noticed you when you stopped giving, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and drop the name of your city in the comments. Now let's begin. The ball at Ravensmere Court had been Arabella's idea, not the ball itself. Those were scheduled obligations written into the calendar of every great Yorkshire house. But the particular Saturday in late October, when the autumn had turned the grounds gold, and the evening air still carried enough warmth to leave the terrace doors open. She had suggested the date to the household steward in August, when Sebastian had returned from London quieter than usual, and the distance between them had stretched wide enough that she could stand in the same room with him and feel completely alone. She had thought a ball. Music. The kind of evening that strips formality from a house and replaces it with something almost human. She had thought, perhaps this will give us a reason to stand close to each other again. Arabella spent 3 hours preparing for that evening, and that was not vanity. It was the calculated effort of a woman who understands that the ground beneath her marriage has shifted and is not certain when it happened or how. She chose the gown Sebastian had admired 14 months ago. Ivory silk with pale gold trim at the sleeves, simple enough to move in, elegant enough to turn heads. And she sat at her dressing table, while her lady's maid Clara dressed her hair, and she told herself quietly in the privacy of her own thoughts that tonight would be different. She had been telling herself variations of that sentence for the better part of a year. Clara pinned the last curl and stepped back. "You look beautiful, Your Grace." Arabella looked at her own reflection for one steady moment. "Thank you, Clara. That will be all for the evening. I'll ring if I need you." She came down the stairs at 8:30. Sebastian was standing in the entrance hall below, speaking with Whitmore about the evening's arrangements, his back 3/4 turned to the staircase. She descended 12 steps before he turned, and when he did, his eyes moved across her once with the brief confirming glance of a man verifying that his wife was dressed appropriately for the occasion. He said, "The Ashworths have arrived. You should greet them." That was all. She kept her expression pleasant. She moved past him toward the drawing room, and she felt something cold settle at the base of her chest. Not yet grief, not yet, but the precursor to it. The recognition that what she had hoped for this evening had already in the first 30 seconds been denied. She greeted the Ashworths. She greeted the Forsyths, the Pemworths, the Hartleys, and the Bainbridges, and the half-dozen other families who arrived in carriages from neighboring estates, and she did it with the warmth and precision she had spent 2 years developing, because that was what she knew how to do. And because the alternative, standing in the entrance hall, feeling the cold thing in her chest expand, was not something she would permit in public. Sebastian stood beside her for the first 20 minutes and was exactly what a duke was supposed to be. Composed, commanding, correct in every particular. He did not look at her once. The guests were shown in. The orchestra found its rhythm. The ballroom filled with candlelight and conversation, and the particular hum of a great house performing itself for company. And Arabella moved through it with a smile that cost her more than anyone in the room would ever know. She took a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioned herself near the tall windows where she could see the whole room without being required to be at the center of it. And she watched her husband work the gathering with the practiced ease of a man entirely in his element. How was good at this? She had never disputed that. Sebastian Wycliffe, Duke of Ravensmere, was one of the most capable men she had ever encountered, and the qualities that made him formidable, his intelligence, his self-possession, the authority he carried without apparent effort, were the same qualities that had made her at 26 believe she could build something real with him. She was still building. She was no longer certain he was building alongside her. Lady Cecily Ashworth appeared at her elbow, warm and perceptive as always, the woman who had been kinder to Arabella in her first Yorkshire months than anyone else in the county. "You look extraordinary this evening. Is that the gown from the Hartwell dinner?" The same one. Arabella kept her voice light. I thought it deserved another occasion. Cecily followed her gaze across the room to where Sebastian was deep in conversation with Lord Ashworth, and her expression shifted into the careful neutrality of a woman who notices things and chooses her words accordingly. He didn't say anything when you came down, did he? It was not quite a question. He told me the Ashworths had arrived. Arabella turned from the window. Which was useful information. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Arabella, is that a waltz? Starting come. I want to hear it properly. She redirected the conversation with the smooth efficiency she had learned to apply to anything that threatened to become emotional in public, and Cecily, who understood her well enough to know when not to press, allowed it. They moved toward the music, and Arabella let the orchestra carry her attention for the length of one full waltz, and she did not look for Sebastian in the crowd. She was looking when she told herself she was not. That was the humiliating truth of it. She was always looking. It was near 10 o'clock when Lady Evelina Harcourt arrived. Arabella noticed her immediately. She noticed everyone. It was part of her function, and because Evelina Harcourt was precisely the kind of woman who occupied a room with intention. 30 years old, recently widowed, beautiful, with the particular quality that intelligence and careful self-management produce, she moved through a gathering as though the air in it belonged to her. She was not Arabella's enemy. Arabella had decided that with precision months ago. Evelina had come to dinner twice. She had attended the charity event Arabella organized in September. She had been correct on every occasion, warm, without overstepping, admiring, without crossing any line. She had done nothing wrong. The problem was not what Evelina Harcourt did. The problem was what she made Sebastian do. He crossed the room to her within 10 minutes of her arrival. Arabella watched it happen, watched him disengage from Lord Ashworth with the smooth ease that meant the disengagement was chosen rather than required, and she watched him greet Evelina, and the warmth of it was not excessive, not inappropriate, but unmistakably genuine. He smiled. Not the public smile he wore at events like this one. Not the correct, composed expression of a duke managing his obligations. The other kind, the kind that reached his eyes, that changed the set of his shoulders, that made him look for one unguarded moment, like a man who was somewhere he actually wanted to be. Arabella had not seen that smile in 4 months. She stood by the windows and looked at it, and she felt something arrive in her chest that she recognized because she had felt it before on other evenings in other rooms, and had always pushed it back down and called it her own insufficient patience. Tonight, she did not push it down. Tonight she looked at it directly and understood what it was. It was grief, clean cold and completely honest. Lady Cecily reappeared beside her. Her voice was very quiet. He is very attentive to Lady Harcourt this evening. She is recently bereaved. Arabella's voice was even. He is being kind. Of course. Neither of them said anything else. The orchestra moved from a waltz into a country reel, and the floor opened with noise and movement, and Sebastian did not dance. He stood with Evelina near the far fireplace, and whatever they were speaking about held him completely. She could see his hands moving the way they did when he was genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. And she could see the angle of Evelina's head, that particular tilt that said, I am the kind of woman who understands you. Arabella set her champagne glass on the window ledge. She did it without drama. She turned to Cecily. I think I shall get some air. She did not go to the terrace. She walked to the entrance corridor, and she stood there alone for a moment, and she looked back at the ballroom, the light, the music, the dancers. Her husband in his corner with his genuine smile, aimed at someone who was not her, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its calmness, I have given everything I know how to give. It has not been enough, and I do not know what more there is. The thought did not break her. That was what she had not expected, that when this moment finally arrived it would not feel like shattering. It would feel like arriving somewhere she had been walking toward for a very long time. She found her wrap on the rack near the door. The footman stationed there looked at her with the trained blankness of a well-managed servant. Her Grace is leaving. Her Grace is unwell. Her voice was entirely composed. Please do not disturb His Grace while he is with his guests. Have my lady's maid informed she is in the upper servants' hall. She will travel with me. Yes, Your Grace. Clara was summoned within minutes, asking no questions, pulling her own wrap on with the efficient calm of a woman who had served Arabella long enough to understand when silence was the correct response. They went down the front steps together, and Arabella asked the head groom for the carriage. Not the formal one, just the covered brougham quickly without fuss, and the groom was practical enough not to look surprised. Inside the carriage with Clara, quiet across from her, and the October night coming through the window. Through the window, Arabella did not cry. She had cried before in private, with the contained discipline of a woman who understood that weeping solved nothing, and that dignity once surrendered is difficult to reclaim. Tonight she did not cry, because she was not sad in the way she had been sad on other nights. She was something else entirely. Something without a precise name in the vocabulary she had been given. She was decided. Back inside Ravensmere Court, the ball continued without her. Sebastian did not notice immediately. That was the truth. She had not let herself state plainly until the carriage was moving and the house lights had receded behind her. He did not notice because in 2 years of marriage, she had never left before him. She had always been there when he turned, always present, always waiting. And because she had always been there, her absence required time to register as real. It was Whitmore who brought it to him. Sebastian was still near the fireplace, the conversation with Evelina, having moved to a Florentine art collection she had visited in the spring, when Whitmore appeared at his elbow with the quiet urgency of a man who has served the Ravensmere household for 20 years and knows when something cannot wait. Your Grace, a moment. Sebastian stepped aside. What is it? Her Grace departed approximately 20 minutes ago, Your Grace. Whitmore kept his voice low, the level of surrounding conversation. She asked that you not be disturbed. Sebastian looked toward the windows. The ledge where Arabella had been standing was empty. The champagne glass she had set there caught the candlelight still half full precisely as she had left it. She asked that I not be disturbed. Those were her words, Your Grace. He stood in the middle of his own ball and felt something tighten across his chest. Not concern, not irritation, but something in between that had no clean name and that he was entirely unequipped to manage. He crossed to the window. He looked at the glass, half full. She had simply set it down and walked away, as though the evening had already given her everything it intended to give her, and she had quietly decided it was not enough. In 2 years, she had never done that. He returned to his guests because the ball was still happening, and he was still the Duke of Ravensmere, and there was no dignified alternative, but for the rest of the evening, he kept looking at the empty place by the windows where she had been standing, and each time he looked, the tightness in his chest was slightly worse than the last time. I went to her room before he retired. He stood outside the closed door in the corridor, his hand raised, and he did not knock. It was past midnight. He told himself whatever needed to be said could wait until morning, and he told himself that with the same confidence he applied to most decisions, and he went to his own rooms. Morning came. He worked for 2 hours in his study as he always did. At 8:30, he went down to breakfast. The breakfast room was set for 1. He stood in the doorway and looked at the single-place setting. 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 arrangement of silverware in the center of a table built for 8, and the tightness returned sharper than it had been the night before. Where is her Grace? The footman near the sideboard was composed and careful. Her Grace took breakfast in her rooms this morning, Your Grace. She sends her regards and says she will be available to discuss household matters at 11 if that is convenient. Available at 11, if that is convenient. Not the language of a wife who had slept poorly and wanted to be left alone. The language of a woman managing her schedule precise and correct and entirely closed. Sebastian sat. He ate. He read the Times. He was the Duke of Ravensmere, and he did not permit household difficulties to disrupt his mornings. But at 11 o'clock, when Arabella came to his study, composed dressed carrying the household ledgers, and sat across from him, and moved through the winter quarter arrangements, with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing a great estate for 2 years, and intended to continue doing so without interruption, he watched her face differently than he had ever watched it. He was looking for the thing beneath the composure, the thing she was not showing him. He could not find it. She was too good. Is there anything else? She gathered the ledgers. The ball last evening was a success. The kitchen staff performed admirably. Arabella. She looked up. Her eyes were clear and entirely unrevealing. Yes. He did not know what he meant to say. He had a dozen things he could have said. He chose the smallest one, because the larger ones were territory he did not yet know how to enter. You left early. I was unwell. Are you recovered? Quite. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She was 28 years old, and she was so completely composed that something in his chest ached. Not guilt, not exactly, but something adjacent to guilt, something he had no good vocabulary for. Good morning, Your Grace. She walked out of his study, and the door closed behind her with the precise, quiet click of a woman who has learned over a long time through careful practice to close doors without slamming them. Sebastian sat behind his desk and looked at the space where she had been, and he could not return to work. He sat there. He looked at the closed door, and the silence she had left behind her was not the comfortable silence of a house running well. It was the silence of something absent that he had not until this moment understood was there. He had always believed she was waiting. Patient, present, reliable. The way the house itself was waiting, the way the estate maintained itself around him. He had never put words to the assumption because it had never required words. It had simply been true. For the first time he was not certain it was still true, and the champagne glass, still half full on the window ledge of his own ballroom, was the most unsettling thing he had seen in a very long time. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so completely quietly final. She had not finished it. She had simply set it down and walked into the night, and she had not looked back, and she had not waited for him to notice. That was the thing that would not leave him. She had not waited. The first thing Sebastian noticed was the dinner table, not the food, not the arrangement of the silver, not the candles, all of which were exactly as they had always been maintained with the same precision that governed every visible surface of Ravensmere Court. What he noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of two people who have run out of things to say and found peace in that, but the particular silence of a woman who has decided without announcement to stop filling a room with her presence. Arabella sat at the opposite end of the long dining table, and she was perfectly correct. She ate. She responded when spoken to. She asked once about the outcome of his meeting with the land agent from Harrogate. But she did not initiate. She did not reach across the space between them with a question or an observation, or one of the small, careful offerings she had always made. The things he had never properly named as offerings, because he had always assumed they would simply be there. He refilled his wine glass. How did you occupy yourself this afternoon? I visited Mrs. Fenwick in the village. Her husband's illness has worsened. I brought provisions from the kitchen. That was thoughtful. It was necessary. She folded her napkin with neat, practiced movements. She has 3 children and no income while he is unable to work. I've asked Mrs. Hartley to arrange a weekly delivery until he recovers. He looked at her across the table. You did not mention this to me. You were in meetings all afternoon. I did not want to disturb you. The phrase landed in the room between them, and she let it sit there without adding anything to it, and he recognized with a discomfort he could not entirely name that she was using his own logic back at him. He did not want to burden you. He had said those words to her once months ago, explaining a decision he had made about a tenant contract without consulting her. She had looked at him very steadily when he said it, and she had not argued, and he had taken her silence for acceptance. He understood now that it had not been acceptance. The Fenwicks are on the north parcel, he said, because he needed to say something practical, something that kept the conversation on solid ground. I should have been informed. I will inform you next time. She looked up from her napkin. Her expression was pleasant and entirely closed. Is there anything else you need from me this evening? There it was again, that language. Precise. Correct. The language of a woman managing her obligations rather than sharing an evening with her husband. He had heard it before in the days since the ball, and each time it arrived it carried a faint quality of wrongness that he could not articulate without feeling that he was being unreasonable. No, he said. That will be all. She excused herself from the table. He sat alone with his wine and listened to her footsteps recede down the corridor, and he noticed he could not help noticing now that he had started that they were unhurried. She was not escaping. She was simply leaving at the moment of her own choosing, with the calm of a woman who had decided that waiting was no longer something she intended to do. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. The pattern did not break. If anything, it sharpened. Arabella arrived at breakfast after him and departed before him, always with a specific destination. The morning room, the village, a call on Lady Cecily Ashworth, a meeting with the housekeeper about the winter larder. She moved through Ravensmere Court with the same competence she always had, managing the estate's social and domestic life with a precision that continued to impress him even now, when he was paying a different kind of attention to it. But she had stopped waiting. That was the thing he kept returning to. She had stopped arriving in the doorway of his study at the end of the afternoon, as she had done in the first year of their marriage, standing there with some small question about the household that he now suspected was not always a genuine question, but an excuse to be in the same room with him. She had stopped suggesting they take tea together. She had stopped saving things up to tell him over dinner, small observations, bits of local news, the kind of conversation that required no particular response, but filled the space between two people with something warm. She had stopped asking. He had not noticed, until it stopped, how much he had relied on her asking. On the 10th day after the ball, Sebastian was leaving his study after a long afternoon with the estate solicitor when he nearly collided with Arabella in the corridor. She was moving quickly, carrying a folder of papers, and she stepped to the side with a neat, practiced movement that made room for him without requiring him to slow down. "Forgive me." Her voice was even. "I did not hear you coming." "Where are you going?" "The morning room. I need to review the correspondence from the Whitmore estate. My father's solicitor has sent the quarterly accounting." He fell into step beside her. He did not entirely mean to. "I was not aware your father's solicitors corresponded with you directly." "They always have. My father left the management of the Whitmore Trust to me." She did not look at him as she walked. "I handle it on the 1st of each month. I thought you knew." "I did not know." She paused outside the morning room door. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition. "There are quite a few things you did not know," she said, without accusation, without heat. "I did not always make them easy to see." She went into the morning room and closed the door. He stood in the corridor and looked at the closed door and felt the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of a man realizing that the house he has lived in for 2 years contains rooms he has never entered. He went back to his study. He could not work. He sat at his desk and turned a pen over in his hands, and he thought about the Whitmore Trust and the Fenwick family on the north parcel, and the ball his wife had organized in October with such careful precision, wearing a dress he had once admired and apparently not forgotten. And he tried to count with honest effort how many times in the past 2 years he had asked her a question that was not about the household schedule. He could not reach a satisfying number. The following Tuesday, Lord Ashworth came to Ravensmere for a morning meeting about the railway investment they were jointly managing, and brought his wife, as he often did. Lady Cecily Ashworth was one of the few people in Yorkshire whose company Arabella seemed genuinely to enjoy, and the arrangement had always been that the men met in the study while the women took morning coffee in the drawing-room. Sebastian finished with Ashworth at 11:30 and walked with him toward the drawing-room to collect Cecily for luncheon. He heard the voices before he opened the door. Arabella's voice, low and direct with a warmth in it he had not heard in weeks. Cecily's voice responding with the particular tone of a woman saying something she means seriously. He stopped in the corridor. He did not mean to eavesdrop. He was simply there, and the door was not quite latched, and the words came through clearly enough. "You seem steadier," Cecily said. "Since the ball. I don't mean that unkindly." "I know you don't." A pause, the small sound of a cup being set down. "I think I simply stopped waiting for something to change on its own. It is extraordinary how much energy that frees up. And Sebastian. Sebastian is Sebastian." Her voice was not cold. It was matter of fact. "He is a good man who has never been required to look closely at anything he did not choose to examine. That is not cruelty. It is simply how he was made." "And what will you do?" The pause this time was longer. "I do not know yet, but I have stopped pretending that contentment and resignation are the same thing. That is a start." Sebastian stepped back from the door. He moved down the corridor without making a sound. He turned into the entrance hall and stood there alone, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Something he had not felt, perhaps, since the earliest days of inheriting the dukedom, when the weight of everything he did not yet know how to carry had pressed down on him with its full and unforgiving force. He felt uncertain, not about the estate, not about the investments, not about the dozen practical matters that required his management and attention. He felt uncertain about something that did not appear in ledgers or correspondence or solicitors' reports, something that had apparently been developing in his own house in the rooms where his wife moved and worked and thought while he had been paying attention to everything except her. She had stopped pretending that contentment and resignation are the same thing. He repeated it to himself slowly, the way he repeated financial figures when he wanted to understand their implications. And the implication arrived cold and clear: she had been pretending. For some time, she had been pretending, and he had accepted the performance as the reality because it was more convenient than looking closely. Luncheon was quiet. The four of them sat at the table, and the conversation moved through its expected channels: the railway investment, the upcoming winter season in London, a charitable committee Lady Cecily was organizing. Arabella was composed and attentive. She said exactly the right things at the right moments. She did not look at Sebastian with any expression other than the pleasant, contained one she had been wearing since the ball. But he watched her differently now. He watched her listen to Cecily's account of the charitable committee with genuine interest, the slight forward lean, the specific follow-up questions that showed she had retained every detail, and he watched her handle Lord Ashworth's occasional pomposity with a dry, precise wit that made Cecily laugh and made Ashworth blink, and he watched her manage the table, the way she managed everything, with an authority that was quiet enough to be invisible until you were paying attention. He had not been paying attention. That evening, after Ashworth and Cecily had departed, he went to find her. She was in the library, not reading, working. There were papers spread across the reading table and an open ledger beside them, and she was writing in the neat compressed hand she used for correspondence, and she did not look up when he came in, which meant she heard the door, but did not turn from her work to greet him. That too was new. The Ashworths have a long drive back to Halford. He stayed near the door. They do. I hope the weather holds. She turned a page without pausing. Arabella. She looked up then. Her pen was still in her hand. I should like to speak with you. He moved to the chair across the reading table from her and sat without waiting for an invitation, because he was the Duke of Ravensmere, and sitting in chairs in his own library did not require invitation, and also because if he waited for permission, he thought she might redirect him with that polished, practiced pleasantness, and he would lose the moment. Not about the household. Her pen lowered. All right. I heard something you said to Lady Cecily this morning. A beat. He watched her decide very quickly how to receive that. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted. Not alarm, not anger, but a kind of careful assessment. And what did you hear? That you have stopped pretending contentment and resignation are the same thing. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the Yorkshire night. Inside, Arabella sat with her pen in her hand and looked at him across the reading table and said nothing. I want to understand what that means, he pressed. I want to understand what has been happening. Sebastian. Her voice was careful and very even. What do you believe has been happening? I believe you are angry about the ball. Do you? It was not a question. I believe Lady Harcourt's presence upset you, and that you left as a result, and that you have been managing your feelings about it in the days since. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the pen down very deliberately on the reading table. I am not angry about Lady Harcourt. Her voice was quieter now and precise, and he understood instinctively that what she was about to say was something she had said very carefully in her own mind before this moment. Evelina Harcourt is not the problem. She has never been the problem. She is simply a mirror. A mirror. You smiled at her at the ball. A real smile. The kind you used to give me in the first months after we married when you still looked at me. She did not look away. I cannot remember the last time you smiled at me that way. I tried to remember it afterward on the drive home. I could not. He had no immediate answer for that. The truth was that he could not remember it either, and the inability produced a discomfort that sat directly behind his sternum and refused to move. I am not asking you to account for it, she said before he could speak. I am not accusing you of wrongdoing. I am simply telling you what I saw, so that when you ask what has been happening, you have an honest answer. What do you want from me? The question came out more plainly than he intended. Nothing that cannot be given. She folded her hands on the table. But I am done asking for it. That is what has changed. He leaned forward. You have not asked me for anything, Sebastian. Something moved through her voice, not anger, not grief, but a kind of exhausted clarity that was somehow harder to receive than either. I have asked you in every way except direct speech for 2 years. I asked you when I sat in the doorway of your study at the end of every afternoon. I asked you when I saved things up to tell you at dinner. I asked you when I planned the ball in October wearing a dress you once admired, thinking, hoping. She stopped. Drew a quiet breath. I asked. You were busy. I asked again. The estate required your attention. I asked in every quiet way I knew how to ask, and you were never unkind, and you never noticed. And I have decided on the drive home from the ball that I am finished asking quietly. The silence afterward was the longest of the evening. He sat with it. He was a man who had learned over 39 years to sit with difficult financial realities and legal complications and the grinding, unglamorous work of maintaining a great estate, and he had learned to approach those difficulties with patience and logic. He tried to apply that now. He tried to take what she had said and arrange it into something he could work with. What he found when he was honest was that she was right. Not completely right. He was not a negligent husband in the ways that the word usually implied. He had not been cruel. He had not been faithless. He had provided everything a Duchess of Ravensmere was supposed to require, and he had provided it reliably and without complaint. But she had not asked for what a Duchess of Ravensmere was supposed to require. She had asked in every quiet way she knew for something else. For him to see her. For him to turn toward her with the same quality of attention he gave to everything else in his life. He had not done that. He could not argue otherwise. He had been too busy being respected to notice that he was not in any meaningful sense understood. I hear you, he said finally. I know you do. She picked up her pen. You are an intelligent man. I would like to, Sebastian. She met his eyes. Her own were calm and unflinching, and for the first time he saw in them what he should have seen much earlier. Not anger, not tears, but the steady, clear-eyed look of a woman who has made a decision about herself and is no longer negotiating it. It is late. You have the meeting with the railway board tomorrow morning, and I have correspondence to finish. Let us not have the rest of this conversation tonight, when we are both tired, and when anything either of us says will be too quick and too simple. It was a reasonable thing to say. It was the kind of reasonable, precise thing she always said. He had always taken it as composure. He wondered now if composure was what it was, or whether it was something more complicated. The skill of a woman who had learned to protect herself by being completely, unassailably sensible. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. Arabella. She looked up from her papers. The dress. He said it before he could think better of it. At the ball. You were, I should have said something, when I saw you come down the stairs. A small silence opened. Yes, she answered very quietly. You should have. He left her to her work. I went to his own rooms and sat in the chair near the window and did not read, did not work, did not distract himself with any of the productive occupations he normally employed against a restless mind. He simply sat in the dark with the discomfort he had earned and let it be exactly as uncomfortable as it was. She was still in the library. He could picture her, the neat hand, the open ledger, the fold of her dress across the chair, the particular quality of focus she brought to anything she decided to apply herself to. He knew she would work until she was satisfied, and not a moment longer, and that she would close the ledger exactly as she had opened it with care without waste. He had married a woman who managed his household with quiet excellence, organized his social obligations with precision, handled her own family trust without assistance, went into the village to care for a sick tenant's family without waiting for his direction, and had apparently been doing all of this while simultaneously quietly and without complaint being lonely. He had not known. He had not asked. He pressed his hands against his knees and breathed through the recognition of that. And it was not comfortable, and he did not try to make it comfortable because he had spent the past 2 weeks being comfortable while she had been carrying something he should have seen and hadn't. He owed her more than a comfortable evening. Downstairs, the library light was still on. He could see it from the window, the faint glow against the dark of the east wing. She was still working. For the first time in 2 years, that light felt like something he was not part of. And the feeling was not one he intended to leave unchanged. Something had moved in him. Not a sudden revelation. Not the swift dramatic turn of a man in a story who sees the truth in a flash of light and acts immediately. It was slower than that, and more honest. It was the particular grinding discomfort of a man who has been wrong in a way that cannot be corrected by a single conversation or a well-chosen gesture, and who understands clearly for the first time that the work ahead of him is real and sustained and entirely deserved. The library light burned on. He watched it until it went out. He started in the library. Not because he planned to. Not because he woke that Wednesday morning with a clear strategy and a list of things to examine, but because the library was where she had been sitting when she said the thing that had not left him. And because when a man finally decides to look honestly at something he has been avoiding, he tends to begin where the discomfort is sharpest. He told Whitmore he was not to be disturbed. He sat at the reading table where Arabella had been working the night before, and he opened nothing, and he simply thought. What he was looking for was not evidence of wrongdoing. He was not a man who needed to construct a legal case against himself. What he was looking for was the shape of what he had missed. The outline of a life that had been happening inside his house in the margins of his attention, while he had been focused on the things he considered central. He began methodically with the estate records, not because he thought the estate records would tell him anything personal. He went there first because it was the ground he knew best, because numbers were honest in a way that memory was not, and because he had learned in 20 years of managing a complex estate that the truth of how a place is running always lives in the details no one thinks to hide. He pulled the household accounts for the past 18 months. I was not looking for irregularities. He found something more unsettling than irregularities. He found competence, a level of competence so consistent and so quietly achieved that it had become invisible in exactly the way that things you can always rely on become invisible. He found that the household costs had decreased by 11% in the 14 months since Arabella had taken over direct management from the previous housekeeper, not through cuts, not through denial of necessary expenditure, but through renegotiated supplier contracts and a reorganized kitchen schedule and a dozen small decisions that added up to something substantial. He had not noticed. He pulled the correspondence files. He found letters from local families, tenant families, small landholders, the vicar, the village schoolteacher addressed to the Duchess, thanking her for specific acts of assistance he had not been aware of and had not authorized. A family in the South Quarter who had been facing eviction after a failed harvest had written to thank Her Grace for interceding with the estate steward and arranging a 6-month deferral on their rent. He had not known about the deferral. He had not known about the family's difficulty. He found a letter from the local magistrate written 8 months ago, thanking the Duchess of Ravensmere for her assistance in a property dispute between 2 tenant families. A dispute that the magistrate noted had threatened to become a legal matter, requiring significant time and expense, until Her Grace had proposed a boundary arrangement that both parties accepted. He had not known about the dispute. He had not known about Arabella's involvement. He had not known that his wife had apparently sat down with 2 farming families and brokered an agreement that saved everyone, including himself, considerable trouble. He sat with that for a long time. Then he found the letter from Lord Pembury. It was dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks, which meant it had arrived at precisely the moment when the distance between him and Arabella was at its most visible, when she had stopped waiting for him, and he had begun slowly, and without full comprehension, to feel her absence. The letter was from Lord Pembury, who sat on the board of the Yorkshire Agricultural Association, and it was addressed not to Sebastian, but to Arabella, and it thanked her for the presentation she had given at the association's autumn meeting on the subject of improved drainage systems for upland farming. Sebastian read it twice. He had not known she attended the autumn meeting. He had not known she had given a presentation. He had not, if he was honest with himself, known she had any particular knowledge of agricultural drainage, though he could see now, looking back across 2 years of household conversations, that she had asked him questions about the subject on at least 3 separate occasions. Questions he had answered briefly and not elaborated on because he had been on his way somewhere else. She had taken his brief answers and built something with them. Lord Pembury's letter described her presentation as unusually rigorous and practically valuable, and noted that several of the association's members intended to trial her proposed approach on their own land in the spring. She had not mentioned it to him, not once. He pushed back from the reading table and stood, because he needed to move, and the reading table was beginning to feel like an indictment. He crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds gray and still under the November sky, and he said aloud to no one, "Why did you never tell me?" He already knew the answer. She had given it to him in the library 2 nights ago. "Because I thought you would notice." He had not noticed. He had been the Duke of Ravensmere conducting the business of the dukedom with diligence and intelligence, and his wife had been conducting her own remarkable quiet parallel business right beside him, and he had taken it all, her competence, her discretion, her management of everything from the household accounts to a property dispute to an agricultural presentation as part of the furniture of his life, as the correct background functioning of a well-run estate, as evidence that everything was in order, rather than as evidence that she was extraordinary. He needed to find her. She was not in the morning room where she usually spent the late morning hours on correspondence. She was not in the drawing room. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, informed him with careful neutrality that her Grace had gone out to the village, she believed, with the weekly provisions basket for the Fenwick family. He took his coat and went after her. He found her on the lane that led back from the village, walking with the empty basket on her arm and moving at the brisk, purposeful pace she used when she was thinking. She did not hear him coming until he was close enough that she stopped, turned and looked at him with the measured expression she had been wearing since the ball, composed, careful waiting to assess what this was before deciding how to respond. "Sebastian." Not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. "I have been going through the correspondence files." He fell into step beside her without asking. "And the household accounts." "Have you?" Not alarm, not guilt, simply attentiveness. Lord Pembury's letter. He watched her face. From 6 weeks ago. Something moved behind her eyes, brief and carefully controlled. "That was addressed to me personally. It was in the correspondence file. Then I must have misfiled it." She kept walking. "Arabella." He reached out, not to stop her, not to take her arm, but just enough contact to make her slow. She slowed. She did not pull away, but she held herself with the particular tension of a woman who is allowing something rather than welcoming it. "You gave a presentation to the Yorkshire Agricultural Association. I shared some observations. It was not, 'They are trialing your proposed drainage approach in the spring, on multiple properties.' She was quiet for several steps. 'The approach is sound. The evidence supports it.' I know." He stopped walking. She stopped as well because he had, and she turned to face him on the lane. "I know it is sound. I know the evidence supports it. I know because you asked me 3 separate questions about upland drainage over the past 2 years, and I answered them briefly, and you built something from those answers that Lord Pembury has described as unusually rigorous, and I did not know any of it was happening." Her chin lifted just slightly. Not defiance. Something closer to the response of a person who has been seen suddenly after a long time of not being seen and is not entirely certain how to receive it. "It did not seem worth mentioning. You helped a family in the South Quarter keep their home. You resolved a property dispute that would have cost everyone involved months of legal expense. You saved this estate 11% on its household costs in 14 months. You can. He stopped because the list was longer than he could deliver efficiently, and because listing her accomplishments like a ledger item was precisely the kind of thing she was right to be tired of. None of it seemed worth mentioning. You were busy. The words were quiet and entirely without edge, which made them land harder than any anger could have. You are always busy, Sebastian. The estate requires your attention. The railway board requires your attention. The tenant disputes require your attention. I did not want to burden you. She used his own phrase with the same precision she had used it the night after the ball, and this time he heard it fully. Not as a gentle reminder, but as the exact description of a pattern so established between them that she had absorbed his language and was reflecting it back at him. He had told her not to burden him. Not in those words, perhaps not ever in direct words, but in every choice of what he attended to and what he left unattended. He had communicated it clearly enough that she had learned it and adapted to it and built a quiet parallel life around the assumption that her concerns, her work, her contributions were secondary. That was not what I meant. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I know it was not what you meant. She met his eyes. That does not change what it communicated. He had no answer for that. He was a man accustomed to having answers, accustomed to the authority that came with his position and his intelligence, and the simple fact that he was generally the most capable person in most rooms. He entered, and he stood on a November lane with the empty provisions basket on his wife's arm, and he had nothing to say. That was not either too little or too late. Arabella, I want to fix this. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the moors and moved through the space between them, and she stood in it with her composure intact and her eyes steady, and she said, I know you do. Then tell me what you need. I have told you what I need. Her voice was patient and very clear. I told you in the library. I am finished asking quietly. That means you must begin looking, not because I have pointed at something, not because a crisis has forced it, but because you have decided without my prompting that I am worth the effort of paying attention. She walked past him. She went up the lane toward the house, not quickly, not angrily, simply steadily, the way she did everything, and he turned and watched her go and felt the particular cold of a man who has identified the problem with great precision and discovered that the solution is entirely and uncomfortably up to him. The next morning, he went to find Lady Cecily Ashworth. He drove to Halford House himself without explanation to his staff and was shown into the sitting room where Cecily was engaged in what appeared to be a voluminous personal correspondence. She looked at him when he came in, looked at him with the bright assessing intelligence of a woman who had known Arabella for 3 years and had formed, he suspected, very clear opinions about the state of the Ravensmere marriage. Your Grace. She did not invite him to sit, which told him she intended to make this brief. He sat anyway. I need to ask you something, Lady Cecily. I need you to be honest with me. I am always honest. A small pause. Whether or not it is requested. How long has Arabella been unhappy? The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She set down her pen. She considered him with a careful steadiness that reminded him sharply of Arabella's own expression in the library. That is the wrong question, Your Grace. He waited. Arabella has not been unhappy in the sense you mean. She has not been crying in private or spending her mornings with a headache or losing weight from worry. She is not that kind of woman. Cecily folded her hands in her lap. The question is not how long she has been unhappy. The question is how long she has been making herself smaller. He was very still. Explain what you mean. I mean that when I met her 2.5 years ago, before she became the Duchess of Ravensmere, she was one of the most intellectually alive people I had encountered in a decade of Yorkshire society. She had opinions. She argued them. She was genuinely, visibly interested in everything from agricultural policy to musical theory to the question of women's education. Cecily held his gaze. And then she married you, and she learned what you required of a wife. And she became very, very good at being exactly that. The words hit him with the same force as something he had read once in a legal document, the kind of clause that seems routine until you grasp what it actually commits you to. I did not ask her to change. No. Cecily's voice was not unkind. You did not need to ask. You simply needed to be entirely satisfied with what was in front of you, and she needed to be loved by you, and the calculation made itself. He drove back to Ravensmere in silence. He sat in the carriage and looked at nothing, and felt the full weight of what Cecily Ashworth had told him settle across his shoulders with the finality of a verdict. She had made herself smaller. For 2 years, a woman of uncommon intelligence and capability had been editing herself, reducing, adjusting, fitting herself into the dimensions of what he seemed to notice and require, because she wanted him to love her, and she had not known any other way to try. And he had been satisfied. He had been entirely satisfied. He had thought he had a good wife, a capable wife, a wife who managed his household and his social obligations with quiet excellence, and he had never once asked what it cost her. He came back to find her in the long gallery, speaking with one of the junior housemaids, a young woman who had apparently made some error with the guest linen, and was receiving what appeared from the doorway to be a correction administered with characteristic Arabella precision. Not harshly, not unkindly, but directly with the specific detail and clear expectation of a woman who manages her staff with respect and means what she says. The housemaid left. Arabella turned and saw him, and the composed mask came up. He could see it happen, that slight adjustment, and he felt a flash of grief that surprised him with its sharpness, because he understood now that the mask was not her, and that she wore it for him, and that somewhere along the way she had decided it was safer than the alternative. "Sebastian." She waited. He crossed to her. "I went to see Lady Cecily this morning." That surprised her. He watched it land the small, genuine flicker before the composure reassembled. "Did you? She told me something I needed to hear." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and close enough that there was no room for either of them to retreat into formality. "She told me that before you married, you were someone who had opinions, and argued them, and was interested in everything, and that afterward you learned what I required, and became very good at being that." Arabella said nothing. She was very still. "Is that true?" A breath. "One." Then very quietly, partly. "Which part is not true?" "I did not become someone else entirely." Her voice was careful and precise. "I made choices. I decided what to put forward and what to hold back, and I made those choices because I wanted you to see me as capable, as suited to the position, as worthy of your respect." She paused. "I did not understand at the time that I was teaching you to see only the parts I presented. You were afraid." He said it not as an accusation, but as the plain, honest recognition of a man who was finally looking directly at something he should have seen long ago. "You were afraid I would not value what you actually were." Her jaw tightened. Not anger. The particular tension of someone receiving a truth they have known privately for a long time and are hearing spoken aloud for the first time. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I was." He reached out and took her hand. She did not pull away. She did not lean in. Either she stood with her hand in his, in that space of cautious equilibrium, and he held it carefully, aware that what he was holding was more fragile than it appeared. "I have been a poor husband," he said. "Not in the ways I told myself mattered, but in the ways that actually mattered. I have been satisfied with less than you were, and I let that satisfaction excuse me from looking more closely." She looked at him with those clear, careful eyes. "That is a very honest thing to say." "I am trying to be honest. I am not certain I know yet how to be more than that, but I am beginning to understand what I should have understood 2 years ago." He tightened his hand slightly around hers. "You were worth looking at. You have always been worth looking at. I simply was not looking." The silence stretched between them. Not cold this time, not the silence of distance, but the particular charged quiet of a moment that cannot be undone and cannot be rushed, a moment where something old and damaged is being held up to the light for the first time. And then the footman appeared at the end of the gallery. Unfortunate timing, impeccable correctness with the note on a silver salver. And Arabella stepped back, and her hand came out of his, and the moment passed into the ordinary afternoon. She took the note. She read it. Something moved through her expression. "It is from my father's solicitor." She folded the note with neat, precise movements. "There is a matter with the Whitmore Trust that requires my attention in London. I will need to travel within the fortnight. I will come with you." She looked up. The surprise was genuine. He could see that the unmasked flicker of it. "The railway board has business in London," he said. "I had been planning to send a representative. I will go myself instead." He held her gaze. "We can travel together." A long moment passed. He did not rush it. "All right," she answered finally. It was a small word. It was 2 syllables. It meant almost nothing and everything simultaneously, and he understood with a clarity that was new to him, and slightly uncomfortable in the way that genuine clarity always is, that he had a long road ahead of him, and that this was only the first step on it, and that she knew it too, and that she was willing just barely to see if the road led somewhere different than where they had been. That evening he came to dinner first, for the first time in months, and he was seated when she arrived, and he stood when she came in. Not from obligation, from the habit of manners, but deliberately with the intention that she should see it. And he held her chair, and he asked her when they were both seated. Not about the household, and not about his schedule, and not about any of the dozens of practical things that had populated their conversations for 2 years. He asked, "Tell me about the drainage presentation. How did you develop the argument?" She looked at him across the candles for a moment, measuring the sincerity of it. Then she began to talk. And he listened. Not with the half-attention of a man managing several things simultaneously, but with the full directed attention he gave to matters he considered genuinely important. And for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately name, the dinner table at Ravensmere Court did not feel like a performance. It felt tentatively and imperfectly, and with the particular fragility of something that has been broken and is not yet repaired, like the beginning of something that had been promised and had not yet been delivered. Neither of them mentioned it. They were both too careful, too aware of how easily the ground could shift again. But it was there in the extra half hour they stayed at the table after the covers were cleared. In the second question he asked, before the first answer was finished, in the way she stopped mid-sentence to check his face, and found this time that he was still there. Still looking. He was still looking. The journey to London took 2 days. They traveled in the Ravensmere private carriage, not the open one used for short local distances, but the enclosed well-sprung coach that Sebastian used for serious travel, the one fitted with reading lamps and a small compartment for documents. He had used it dozens of times alone, or with Whitmore, or with his solicitor. He had never in 2 years of marriage used it with Arabella. She brought a satchel of correspondence, and a book she did not open. He brought the railway board papers. He did not read. They sat across from each other as the Yorkshire moorland gave way to the Midland counties, and they talked not about the household, not about the estate, not about the schedule of obligations waiting for them in London. They talked the way 2 people talk when they are paying genuine attention to each other for the first time, and discovering, with a mixture of wonder and something close to mourning, how much territory had gone unexplored. She told him about the Whitmore Trust, not the quarterly accounting, not the dry numerical summary she had always provided when he asked, but the actual history of it, the story her father had told her when she was 17, about why the trust existed, the specific properties it protected, the families connected to those properties whose names she knew and whose circumstances she tracked with the same care she applied to the Ravensmere tenants. He had not known her father had taught her about the trust at 17. He had not known she had been managing the details herself since she was 21, when the previous solicitor retired, and her father, confident in her ability, had simply transferred the responsibility without ceremony. "Your father trusted you with that at 21. My father trusted me with most things." Her voice was level, but something in it had warmth, the particular warmth of a woman speaking about a man she had genuinely admired. He used to say that intelligence does not divide by gender, only by application. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. She looked at him steadily. He also warned me before I married you that aristocratic men are sometimes very slow to recognize intelligence in a wife, because they do not expect to find it. Sebastian absorbed that with the careful stillness of a man receiving a justified blow. And what did you tell him?" "I told him you were different." A small pause. "I believed it at the time." The carriage moved through the afternoon. He did not deflect the comment. He did not argue it. He sat with it in the way. "I believed it at the time." The carriage moved through the afternoon. He did not deflect the comment. He did not argue it. He sat with it in the way he had been learning over the past 3 weeks to sit with uncomfortable truths, not flinching, not defending, just letting them occupy their full, undiminished weight. "Were you wrong?" he asked finally. "About whether I was different?" She considered the question with her usual precision. "I think you are different from what you were 6 weeks ago," she said. "Whether you were different from the beginning, that is more complicated." London arrived on the second afternoon with all its noise and density, and they were installed at the Ravensmere townhouse by evening. The household there was smaller, but impeccably managed, and Arabella moved through it with the same quiet authority she brought to Yorkshire, speaking to the housekeeper, confirming the arrangements, making 3 small adjustments to the guest schedule, with the assurance of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. Sebastian watched her do it, and felt the now familiar discomfort of a man recalibrating his perception of something he had looked at for 2 years without properly seeing. The solicitors' meeting was the following morning. Sebastian had offered to accompany her, and she had looked at him with that careful assessing look and said she would let him know. In the morning she came to breakfast and told him the meeting would take approximately 2 hours and that she would appreciate his company if he was able. He cancelled a preliminary meeting with the railway board's secretary. He went. He sat beside her in the solicitor's office in Holborn and watched her conduct the quarterly review of the Whitmore Trust with a precision and fluency that would have impressed him even if she had been a man he had hired for the purpose. She asked specific questions. She caught an inconsistency in the third quarter accounting that the solicitor, a competent man of 50 years' experience, had missed or had hoped she would miss, and she addressed it without heat and without apology, holding her position with a calm authority that produced in the end a correction and a revised summary. On the walk back to the carriage, Sebastian said, "He hoped you would not notice the discrepancy in the third quarter." "He always hopes I will not notice." She did not sound surprised or particularly offended. "He managed the trust for 15 years under my father without ever having his accounting reviewed by the person he reported to. He finds my attention inconvenient. And yet he cannot argue with it. No." A brief, very dry note in her voice. "He cannot." He reached out and opened the carriage door for her. She paused before stepping in, a half-second pause, not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to register that she noticed the gesture, that he had done it deliberately, not from the automatism of manners, but from intention. She stepped in without comment, and he followed, and the carriage moved back toward Mayfair, and he felt that the half-second pause was worth more than anything he could have said. The railway board meeting was the following afternoon. He was 3/4 of the way through a tense discussion about the proposed northern route, when a note was brought in delivered to the meeting room, which meant someone had considered it urgent enough to interrupt. He read it. He set it down. He looked at it again. It was from Lord Harrington, a senior board member whose opinion carried significant weight, and who had until very recently been among the primary supporters of the northern route. The note said without preamble that Harrington had reconsidered his position, that he was withdrawing his support, and that his withdrawal was connected to a private concern about the financial modeling underpinning the route's cost projections. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a significant piece of information has just changed the calculation. Sebastian read the note a third time, and then he said something that surprised every man in the room, including himself. "Gentlemen, I need an hour." He went back to the townhouse. Arabella was in the upstairs sitting room writing letters. She looked up when he came in. "I need your opinion on something." He put the note on the table in front of her. "Read that." She read it. She set it down. She picked up the cost projection summary he had also brought, and she read that too without being asked, which told him she had already identified what he needed her to look at. 4 minutes of silence. Then, the western spur adds 22% to the construction cost and captures only 11% additional capacity. Whoever modeled this made an error in the land acquisition estimates. They used 1879 valuations for parcels that were reassessed in 1882. She set the papers down. Harrington found the same problem. He stared at her. "How do you know the 1882 reassessment figures?" "Because Whitmore land borders the western spur corridor, and I reviewed the reassessment when it happened." She picked up her pen. The northern route as currently modeled will exceed its projected cost by at least 30% within the first 2 years of construction. If Harrington has concluded the same, he is right to withdraw. Sebastian sat down across from her. The board is reconvening in 50 minutes. Then you have sufficient time to present a revised position. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Shall I sketch the corrected projection? It will take 15 minutes. He looked at her, this woman, sitting in his townhouse in the middle of her own afternoon correspondence, setting it aside to sketch a corrected financial projection that was going to save him from a significant and expensive error, doing it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was simply the logical next step. Arabella. His voice came out differently than he intended, rougher, more unguarded. She looked up. When I asked you on the lane in Yorkshire why you never told me what you were doing, all of it, the accounts, the trust, the presentation, you said it did not seem worth mentioning. He held her gaze. I want you to understand something. Every single thing you have done, everything I have found in those files, everything I watched this morning, what you just did with these papers in 4 minutes, none of it is not worth mentioning. Every part of it is extraordinary, and I am ashamed that it took me this long to see it. She was still. The pen was in her hand, and she was looking at him, and for the first time since the night of the ball, the composure was not quite complete. There was something beneath it, something that was not performed, something real and careful, and a little afraid. You should go back to your meeting, she said quietly. I know. He did not move immediately. Will you write the projection? Yes. I went back to the meeting. He presented the corrected analysis with the precision that Arabella's 15-minute sketch had made possible, and he watched the room shift, watched Harrington, who had rejoined the meeting, give him a long assessing look that moved eventually into something resembling respect, and he won the argument cleanly, and the northern route was tabled for revised modeling, and the board moved on. He did not tell the board where the corrected projection had come from. That troubled him on the carriage ride back. It troubled him precisely and specifically, and he let it trouble him rather than finding a way around it, because he was learning that the discomforts he let himself feel fully were more honest than the ones he managed away. At dinner that evening in the smaller, quieter dining room of the townhouse, without the long formal distance of Ravensmere's table, he said, I used your projection in the board meeting. I assumed you would. She poured her own wine, a habit she had apparently developed at some point without his noticing. Did it resolve the matter? The northern route has been sent back for revised modeling. Harrington withdrew his objection. He paused. I did not tell them where the analysis came from. She looked at him. You did not need to. I should have. He held her gaze. It was your work. You should have received the credit for it. Something shifted in her expression. Not the composure. What was beneath it? Sebastian, I do not need credit from the railway board. That is not the point. She was quiet for a moment. Then, no, it is not. She set her wineglass down. What is the point? The point is that I have been taking credit not deliberately, not consciously, but by omission for the functioning of everything around me that you have made possible. The estate runs well. The household is respected in Yorkshire. The Ravensmere name is associated with fair dealing among the tenants, and I have accepted all of that as evidence of my own good management. He looked at her directly. It was not. It was yours, and I intend to say so. Arabella looked at him across the small dinner table, and the thing beneath her composure was fully visible, now visible and undefended, the expression of a woman who has wanted to be seen for so long that being seen has become almost too much to absorb. You are very different from 6 weeks ago, she said quietly. I am trying to be. I know. She picked up her wine. That is what frightens me. He heard the word and did not let it pass. Why does it frighten you? A long silence. The candles moved. Outside London continued its indifferent noise, because she began, and then stopped and started again, which was itself significant because Arabella rarely started over. Because I have wanted this for a very long time, and I know that men can become very sincere when they are afraid of losing something. And sincerity that comes from fear of loss is not the same as sincerity that comes from genuine change. She met his eyes. I cannot tell yet which this is, and I am not willing to rearrange myself around hope again and discover in 6 months that nothing has actually shifted. It was the most honest thing she had said to him in 2 years. Possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to him in considerably longer. He sat with it for the full moment it required, and he did not rush to reassure her, because he understood with a clarity that was becoming slowly his new mode of seeing that she did not need reassurance. She needed honesty. I cannot tell you which it is either, he said. Not with certainty. I can tell you that what I have felt these past weeks is not fear of losing a wife. It is grief at having failed a person I should have valued more carefully. He paused. Those are different things. Whether they are different enough, that is something you will have to determine for yourself over time. She absorbed that. She was quiet for long enough that the footman cleared the first course and brought the second, and neither of them acknowledged him, and then she said, That is a more honest answer than I expected. I am learning to give honest answers. Yes. Something moved in her voice, not quite warmth, not yet, but the tentative presence of something that could become warmth if it was handled carefully. I can see that. They returned to Yorkshire 4 days later. The journey back was different from the journey down. They talked less, not because the distance between them had reasserted itself, but because they had moved past the first layer of things that needed to be said and arrived at the quieter ground beneath it. The ground where two people who are beginning very carefully to find each other again can sometimes simply exist in the same space without filling it. She read her book. He read his papers. Occasionally he looked up and found her looking out the window, and occasionally she looked up and found him looking at her, and neither of them looked away quickly. 3 days after their return, Lady Evelina Harcourt came to call. She arrived on a Tuesday morning unannounced, which was unusual. Evelina was meticulous about social protocols and never arrived without prior arrangement. Arabella was in the morning room when Whitmore brought the card, and she looked at it for a moment and said evenly, "Show her in." Evelina came in with her customary grace and her customary composure, and she sat and she accepted tea and she made the initial conversational movements with her usual fluency. And then she stopped. She set down her teacup. She looked at Arabella directly. "I want to say something that may be uncomfortable." Arabella waited. "I have been aware since the ball in October that my presence at Ravensmere has caused difficulty." Evelina's voice was precise and careful. "I do not believe I have behaved improperly, but I have been aware that Sebastian finds our conversations easier than some others, and I have perhaps not been as careful as I should have been about what that ease communicates." Arabella looked at her for a long moment. "What are you telling me, Lady Harcourt?" "I am telling you that I have declined Sebastian's last 2 invitations to dine at Ravensmere." Evelina held her gaze. "And I am telling you that I have done so because I believe a woman of your intelligence deserves to know that the choice was made deliberately, and not because of any lack of—" She paused. "Not because the invitations were unwelcome. It was an extraordinary thing to say. It was also, Arabella recognized, an act of considerable courage, the kind of honesty that cost something and was offered anyway. He invited you twice since the ball." "Yes. I declined both times, citing prior engagements." Evelina looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "They were not prior engagements." The room held the information for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Arabella's voice was very quiet. "Because I would want to know." Evelina held her gaze without flinching. "And because I think you have been conducting yourself with more dignity than most women would manage, and I did not want you to do so in ignorance." Arabella was still for a long time. She looked at this woman, this beautiful, intelligent, recently widowed woman who could have said nothing and maintained every social advantage, and chosen instead to come here and say something true. And she felt a complicated, clear-eyed respect for her that had nothing to do with liking or disliking. "Thank you," she said finally. "That was not easy to say." "No." Evelina picked up her teacup. "It was not." When Evelina left, Arabella sat in the morning room for a long while alone. She thought about Sebastian, about the 2 invitations he had extended after their evening in the library, after the lane after London, while she had been watching carefully for evidence of whether the change in him was real or conditional. She thought about the fact that he had extended those invitations, and she thought about the fact that Evelina had declined them. He had continued reaching toward an easier thing. She had to acknowledge that clearly, without softening it. He was changing, but he was not yet fully changed, and she had known that, and she had been right to wait and to watch. But Evelina had removed herself. That meant something. She did not know yet precisely what it meant for the larger question of where she and Sebastian were going, but it meant something about the landscape she was navigating, and she needed to understand it before she made any decisions. She went to find him in his study. She did not knock, she simply opened the door and came in, which was not what she normally did, and he looked up from his desk with the immediate attention he now consistently gave her. Evelina Harcourt came to call this morning. He was very still. Did she? She told me she declined 2 dinner invitations from you. She wanted me to know. Arabella stood near the door, not confrontationally, not defensively, simply in the place where she had stopped walking. I am not here to accuse you. I am here because I have been watching you these past weeks and trying to determine whether what is changing between us is real, and I think I am owed the full truth about those invitations. He set his pen down. He did not look away. I extended them. She is correct. Why? Because I was not yet fully honest with myself about what I was doing. He said it plainly, without the protection of justification. I told myself it was ordinary social courtesy. I was wrong. And I did not extend a 3rd invitation when I understood what I was actually doing. When did you understand? In London. When you looked up from that projection and I saw... He stopped, started more carefully. I understood in London that there is nothing Evelina Harcourt offers me that I do not already have standing in my own house. I simply could not see what was in my own house clearly enough to choose it. He held her gaze. I should have seen it years ago. I did not. I see it now. Arabella crossed the room. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair where she had sat weeks ago, delivering household accounts with the efficient distance of a woman who had stopped trying. She sat in it differently now. She sat in it like a person who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay long enough to say what she actually means. I am not ready to pretend that the past 2 years did not happen, she said. I am not able to simply decide that because you are paying attention now, the time when you were not paying attention is resolved. I am not asking you to pretend. Good. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her voice was steady and utterly without performance. Because what I need from you is not apology. I have heard the apology, and I believe it is sincere, and it is not enough on its own. She looked at him directly. What I need is time. I need to see whether the man who has been showing up these past weeks is the man you actually are now, or the man you become when you are afraid. And I cannot know that in a month. I cannot know it in 2 months. I understand. He leaned forward slightly. I am not going anywhere, Arabella. I know you are not going anywhere. Something in her voice shifted a fraction warmer, a fraction less guarded. Neither am I. But I left that ball without saying goodbye, because I was tired of being a woman who stayed in rooms she had outgrown simply because leaving felt impolite. She held his gaze. I will not do that again. Not for obligation, not for appearance, not for the comfort of anyone in this house, except myself. He heard it. He heard the full weight of it, not as a threat, but as a declaration, the statement of a woman who had found the ground beneath her own feet and was standing on it. That is exactly who I want you to be, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was not quite believing, and not quite doubting. It was the particular careful expression of a woman who wants something to be true, and is holding herself back from wanting it to completely. We will see, she said quietly. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She moved toward the door. Arabella. She turned. The ball. He said it without knowing entirely what he meant to follow it with, and then found the words, the dress, the champagne still half full. You had prepared for that evening very carefully. I had. I did not see you come down the stairs. His voice was rough and honest. "I should have been watching for you. I was not. And I am sorry, not because it caused difficulty between us. Because you deserved to be seen, and I failed at that. And it matters to me now in a way it did not then. I cannot explain why it did not matter then, only that it matters now." She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and for the first time in all the weeks since the ball, what he saw in her face was not the composure. It was not the careful mask. It was the woman beneath it, the one who had planned an October ball and worn a dress she remembered and hoped quietly that her husband would see her come down the stairs. She did not speak. She did not need to, but she did not leave immediately. She stood there for one moment longer than was required, and in that moment he understood that he had reached her not fully, not in the way that repairs everything at once, but in the way that matters, the way that tells a person, "I see you. I see the specific, particular, unrepeatable person that you are, and I am not going to look away again." She left. He listened to her footsteps in the corridor. They did not have the particular distance they had carried since October. They had something else, something without a clean name, something fragile and serious and in progress, something that required patience and honesty and the willingness to be seen imperfectly on both sides. Outside, the November day continued. The estate continued. The tenants and the accounts and the correspondence all continued exactly as they always had. But in the study of Ravensmere Court, Sebastian sat with his hands on his desk and felt for the first time that the work truly worth doing had almost nothing to do with the estate at all. He picked up his pen. He wrote a letter, not to the railway board, not to his solicitor, not to any of the dozens of correspondents who regularly required his attention. He wrote to Lord Pembury, chairman of the Yorkshire Agricultural Association, and he wrote to tell him that the drainage proposal presented at the autumn meeting had been developed by his wife, the Duchess of Ravensmere, and that any correspondence regarding its implementation should be directed to her directly and credited to her fully. He signed it. He sealed it. He rang for Whitmore. "See that this goes with the afternoon post." "Yes, Your Grace." The letter went. He did not tell Arabella he had sent it. He did not tell her because it was not done for her gratitude or her approval. It was done because it was right, because it was long overdue, and because a man who is genuinely changing does not announce the evidence of his change. He simply changes and lets the evidence speak for itself. The letter from Lord Pembury arrived on a Thursday morning. Arabella was at breakfast when Whitmore brought it in, addressing it to her directly on the silver salver, with the particular care he gave to correspondence he understood to be significant. She looked at the return address. She looked at it again. She broke the seal without haste and read it at the table, and Sebastian watched her face from across the cups and the toast rack and the small ordinary morning distance between them. He watched the moment she understood what the letter contained. It was not a dramatic moment. She did not gasp. She did not look up immediately. She read it through to the end, the way she read everything completely without skipping, and then she set it down on the table beside her plate, and she was quiet for long enough that he could hear the fire in the grate, and the wind against the windows, and his own heartbeat doing something slightly irregular. "Lord Pembury is writing to me directly," she said finally. "Yes. He says the association has received my contact information from the Duke of Ravensmere and wishes to engage me as a formal advisor on the spring drainage trials." She looked up. Her expression was entirely unreadable, in the way it only was when she was feeling something large enough to require containment. "He says the credit for the proposal has been formally attributed to me in the association's records." Sebastian held her gaze and did not look away. "Did you write to him?" Her voice was very quiet. "Yes." "When?" "The evening after you came to my study, after Evelina Harcourt's visit." He kept his voice level because this was not a moment for performance. "I did not tell you because it was not done to earn something. It was done because your name belongs on your work, and I had allowed it to be invisible for too long." Arabella looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at him. She looked at the letter again. And then she did something he had not seen her do in longer than he could accurately remember. She pressed her lips together, not in the composed, controlled way she usually managed emotion, but in the way of a person who is genuinely, unexpectedly moved and is taking a moment to decide what to do with it. That was, She stopped. Started again. Thank you. You are welcome. He picked up his coffee cup. Pembury is a serious man. He will expect serious engagement. You should prepare thoroughly. Something moved across her face, something that was almost a smile, not quite the beginning of one. I always prepare thoroughly. I know. He met her eyes. I know that now. The week that followed was different from any week that had come before it in the 2 years of their marriage. Not dramatically different, not transformed, not suddenly easy, but different in the specific way that things are different when two people who have been moving parallel to each other begin carefully to move together. She told him about her meetings with the Pembury Association. Not because she needed his input, but because she wanted to tell someone, and because he had finally become someone it was possible to tell things to. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions that showed he had retained the details of what she said. She noticed both, and he saw her notice, and neither of them made it larger than it was. He began showing her the estate decisions before they were made. Not all of them. Not the routine, daily operational matters that did not require 2 minds, but the significant ones. The decisions that would shape Ravensmere for the next decade. The tenant agreements and the investment choices and the land use questions that she had. It turned out been thinking about in parallel for 2 years and had never been asked to contribute to. She contributed now. Her perspective was not his perspective. It was frequently better than his perspective. He told her so once without qualification, and watched her absorb the compliment with the careful attention of a woman who is still deciding whether to trust it. She was still deciding. He understood that. He did not rush it. December arrived and brought with it the season's obligations, the Christmas calls, the tenants' gathering, the charitable distributions to the village families. These had always been Arabella's domain, managed with her characteristic efficiency. But this year, Sebastian arrived beside her at the tenants' gathering without being asked, and stood with her through 4 hours of conversation and connection with the families who worked the Ravensmere land, and he discovered things he had not known. Faces. He had not known stories. He had not known a family in the West Quarter, with a son who had won a scholarship to a grammar school, a widow in the North Cottage, who had been teaching the neighboring children to read for 3 years, with materials Arabella had quietly supplied. Arabella had been supplying them since the previous winter. He had not known. He spoke to the widow, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Calder, and Mrs. Calder looked at him with the direct appraisal of a woman who does not particularly care about dukes, and said, "Your Grace, your wife is the reason half the children in this quarter can read past their names. I expect you know that." He had not known that. He said, "I am beginning to." Mrs. Calder looked at him with an expression that mixed approval with skepticism in equal measure. "Beginning is better than never," she said, and went back to her tea. On the drive home from the tenants' gathering, Arabella sat beside him, not across from him, beside him, which was not her usual position in the carriage, and which she had chosen without comment, and she said, "Mrs. Calder told you about the reading materials." "She did." "I should have mentioned it to you." "Yes." He turned to look at her in the winter dark of the carriage. "You should have, and I should have been the kind of husband you felt you could mention it to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We have both been correcting ourselves." "We have." "It is—" She paused, choosing the way she chose everything. "It is strange to be correcting in the same direction." He reached across and took her hand in the dark without announcement. She let him. She did not pull away, and she did not immediately close her fingers around his, but she let his hand hold hers, and after a moment, not long, 4 or 5 heartbeats, her hand turned slightly in his and held back. They did not speak for the rest of the drive. They did not need to. The crisis, when it came, arrived without warning, and from a direction neither of them expected. It was mid-December, 10 days before Christmas, when Sebastian received a letter from his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere, a woman of 70, imperious, deeply traditional, who had retreated to the dower house 2 years ago, with what she referred to as the requirements of age, and what the household understood to be a calculated preservation of her authority. At a remove, wrote to say that she was coming to Ravensmere for the Christmas fortnight, and that she was bringing with her Sebastian's younger sister, Lady Harriet, and Harriet's husband, Viscount Pemworth, and their 3 children, and that she expected the house to be in appropriate condition for family. The letter was addressed to Sebastian. It did not mention Arabella. He showed it to her that evening. She read it without expression and handed it back and said in her level voice, "I will make the arrangements." Arabella. The east wing will need to be opened for the Pemworths. The children's rooms will require Arabella. He took the letter from her hand. The arrangements can wait. I want to talk about the letter. She looked at him. There is nothing to discuss. Your mother is coming. I will manage the household accordingly. She did not address it to you. No. Her voice was very even. She did not. She has never addressed her correspondence to you directly. That is correct. She met his eyes with the particular steadiness of a woman who has made peace long ago with a specific and ongoing difficulty. Your mother does not consider me her equal, Sebastian. She considered me adequate for the position, adequate for the title, adequate as a choice given the available alternatives. She has been perfectly correct to me on every occasion, and she has never once treated me as a person whose opinion merited her direct attention. He felt the familiar discomfort arrive sharper this time, because he was sharper now because he had been paying attention for long enough, that details he would once have smoothed over now landed with their full force. Has she been unkind? No. Arabella was precise as always. She is never unkind. She is simply absent. I am part of the architecture of Ravensmere, the furniture. She addresses the Duke, and the Duke manages everything else. Including you. Including me. A beat. Or so she has assumed. He put the letter down. I will write to her. Sebastian. I will write to her and tell her that all correspondence regarding Ravensmere, including correspondence about visits and household arrangements, is directed to the Duchess. He kept his voice calm and very deliberate. That is not a negotiable point. You are the Duchess of Ravensmere. You are not the furniture. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he could feel the weight of it, the careful, thorough assessment of a woman who is taking the measure of whether a man means what he has just said. She will not receive it well, Arabella said. I know. She will write back to you directly, and she will be very unhappy. I expect so. And you will not reverse the position when she does. It was not a question. It was a test. A clean, direct test asked without apology, because she had reached the point in their renegotiation where soft questions were insufficient and only direct ones would do. I will not reverse it. He held her gaze. You have managed this household, this estate, and these social obligations with more competence than I had any right to expect from anyone. You have done it while being systematically under-acknowledged by my family, and until recently, by me. My mother will address her correspondence to you because you are the Duchess, and because you have earned every letter of that title, and I will say so clearly in writing before she arrives. Arabella sat very still. Something was happening in her face, something slow and significant, like a long-held muscle finally releasing. Write the letter, she said quietly. He wrote it that night. He wrote it in the plain, direct language he used for correspondence that required no ambiguity, and he signed it, and he gave it to Whitmore for the Morning Post, and he did not soften a single sentence. The Dowager's reply arrived in 4 days. It was addressed to Sebastian. It was not in the strict definition of the word unkind. But it was very clear about her feelings regarding the new arrangement, and it contained a sentence that he read twice and then set down on his desk and left there while he went to find Arabella. She was in the morning room. She looked at his face when he came in and said, She responded. She responded. And he handed her the letter. She read it. The specific sentence her mother-in-law had written 3 paragraphs from the end read, I have always managed my concerns directly with the Duke of Ravensmere, as is appropriate, and I see no cause to alter an arrangement that has functioned perfectly well for 70 years on the grounds of the current Duchess's preferences. Arabella read it twice. She folded the letter. She handed it back. How do you want to handle this? His voice was measured. I want to handle it myself. She looked at him directly. I want to write to her, directly, with your knowledge, but not your involvement. He paused. What will you say? I will say—" She stopped. And then for the first time, he heard in her voice not the composed precision of a woman managing a difficulty, but something warmer and more settled, and considerably more formidable. "I will say that I look forward to welcoming her to Ravensmere, and that I am confident we will find an arrangement that serves the family well, and I will sign it Arabella Duchess of Ravensmere, and I will use the formal seal, A. Beat. And if she arrives and attempts to manage the household over your head, then I will be very gracious and very clear, and she will find that the furniture has developed opinions." Her chin lifted slightly. "I have managed this house for 2 years. I know every corner of it, every servant, every supplier, every tenant. She has not been in residence for 2 of those years. She will not find it easy to redirect what I have built." He felt something he had not felt before, something that was partly pride, and partly the particular recognition of a man who has finally clearly seen who he married. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that afternoon. She showed it to him before she sent it, not for approval, she made that clear, but because she wanted him to know what she had said. He read it. It was as she had described, gracious and clear, and entirely unmistakably firm. He handed it back. "Perfect," he said. She sent it. The Dowager arrived at Ravensmere on the 22nd of December, with Lady Harriet and Viscount Pemworth, and 3 children, and a quantity of luggage that required 4 additional footmen. She came in with the authority of a woman who has managed a great house and intends to remind everyone of it, and she swept into the entrance hall and looked around with the proprietary air of a woman returning to territory she considers her own. Arabella was standing at the top of the entrance stairs. She was wearing the ivory dress. Not as a gesture, not as the hopeful, uncertain offering it had been in October, but with the ease of a woman who knows what she looks like and has chosen it deliberately. She was composed, warm, and entirely in command of herself and the space around her. And she came down the stairs to greet the Dowager with precisely the right combination of respect and authority, and she said, "Welcome back to Ravensmere, Your Grace. We are very glad to have you." The Dowager looked at her. It was a long look. The look of a woman reassessing something she had previously categorized and filed away. Arabella met it without flinching, without softening, without any of the careful self-reduction she had once practiced as a survival strategy. "Arabella." The Dowager's voice was careful. "You are looking well. Thank you." Arabella turned to include the Pemworths with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "Harriet, it is wonderful to see you. And these must be the children. They have grown enormously." She moved the arrival forward. She managed the introductions, the room assignments, the distribution of luggage, the timing of tea, all with the fluid competence of a woman who has been running this house for 2 years and knows it better than anyone in it. Sebastian stood near the door and watched her work, and Lady Harriet appeared at his elbow, with the particular expression of a woman who has noticed something significant. "She is extraordinary," Harriet said quietly. "She always was, actually. I wondered if you knew." "I am beginning to know," he said. Harriet looked at him with her direct, uncomplicated gaze. "Beginning is better than never. That is what people keep telling you, apparently." "Is it that obvious?" "Sebastian." His sister touched his arm briefly. "Arabella is the reason this house feels like a home rather than a property. She is the reason the tenants speak well of Ravensmere. She is the reason your mother, who has been managing great houses since before you were born, just walked in and found that there was nothing to manage." Harriet paused. "The obvious question is how long it took you to see it." He did not answer because the answer was not one he was proud of, but across the entrance hall. Arabella was laughing at something one of the Pemworth children had said, a real laugh. Unguarded, the laugh of a woman who is genuinely present in her own life, and the sound of it moved through him like something warm and permanent, and he thought, "I will hear that sound every day for the rest of my life, or I will spend the rest of my life understanding what it cost me to lose it." He had no intention of losing it. Christmas at Ravensmere that year was the fullest the house had been in half a decade. The Dowager managed by the second day to find her way to a working arrangement with Arabella. Not warmth, not yet, perhaps not ever, but a mutual acknowledgement of competence, that was from the Dowager, as close to respect as she was constitutionally capable of. She began on the third day to direct her household questions to Arabella directly. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Sebastian noticed every instance of it, and he said nothing, and Arabella caught his eye once across the length of the drawing room during an evening of family conversation and card games and the comfortable noise of children and what passed between them. In that look was not romantic, not demonstrative, not anything that could be named or shown. It was simply recognition. The recognition of two people who are navigating something real and difficult and worthwhile together, and who know it, and who have chosen it. The Dowager and the Pemworths departed on the 2nd of January. The house went quiet, as houses do after a family gathering, with the particular settled silence that follows noise and warmth and the presence of many people. Sebastian was in his study. He heard Arabella moving through the upper floor. The footsteps he knew now, the ones that had a different quality than they'd had in October. Less careful, more grounded, the walk of a woman who knows where she is going. She came to his study. She knocked. She still knocked, but she did not wait long before opening the door, and that change, that small compression of the pause, was something he filed quietly as evidence. "I want to talk to you about something." She sat without waiting to be asked. "All right, I have been offered a position." She held his gaze. "Lord Pembury has asked me to chair the Drainage Trials Subcommittee. It would involve quarterly meetings in York, some correspondence, and 2 site visits before the summer." She paused. "It is a formal appointment. It would be listed in the association's records under my name." I understood immediately the weight of what she was telling him. Not just the appointment, but the question embedded in the telling. She was not asking his permission. She was telling him what she intended to do, and watching to see who he was. "When does it begin?" "February." "Will you need additional staff to cover the household management during the site visits?" She blinked. Once. It was the smallest possible expression of surprise, and it was real, and he caught it and held it somewhere carefully, because it told him something important about how low her expectations had been and how far they had both come. "I can manage with the current staff," she said after a moment. "Then accept the appointment." He held her gaze. "Your name should be in those records, Arabella. It should have been there from the beginning." She looked at him. Really looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she reserved for things she was taking seriously, and then she said, "You are not the man I married." "No." He leaned forward. "I am trying to be the man you deserve to marry." The silence that followed was the good kind. The kind that holds something rather than the kind that empties it. "I accepted the appointment yesterday," she said finally. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it elsewhere." He absorbed that, the fact that she had accepted it before telling him, the confidence of it, the self-possession, and he felt something that was entirely and simply pride. Not the proprietary pride of a man whose wife has reflected well on him. The cleaner, more honest pride of a person watching someone they love be exactly, completely themselves. "Good," he said. She stood. She moved toward the door. She stopped. "Sebastian." Her hand was on the doorframe, and she turned back, and her voice was quieter now, the voice she used when she was saying something she had considered carefully. "I have been thinking about what you said, that you are trying to be the man I deserve to marry, and I want to say something about that." He waited. "I do not need you to be perfect." She looked at him with the steady, clear eyes that had first told him in the library weeks ago that she was no longer pretending. "I did not fall into loving you because you were perfect. I fell into it because I thought I could see underneath all the duke of it a person worth knowing." She paused. "I was right about that. I was only wrong about how long it would take you to show him to me." His throat was tighter than he intended. "How much longer are you willing to wait?" "I am not waiting anymore." Her voice was warm and precise and entirely certain. "That is the difference. I am not standing at the edge of a room, hoping you will cross it. I am standing in the middle of mine. And you are welcome in it. You have been working your way toward welcome for 2 months, and you are nearly there." She held his gaze. "But the door to my room is one I open from the inside. You do not get to open it from the outside, Sebastian. You have to be someone I choose to open it for." He stood. He moved around the desk, not toward her, not crossing to her, but standing in the act of standing in the acknowledgement of what she had just said. "I understand that," he said. "I am not asking you to open it. I am asking you to know that I am here, that I am not going anywhere, and that whatever time it takes is time I intend to earn, not wait out." She looked at him for a long, serious moment, and then she opened the door wider, not as a gesture, not symbolically. She simply stepped back, and the door was open between them, and she said, "Come and have tea with me. I want to tell you about the subcommittee's first agenda." He came. They sat in the morning room, the two of them with tea going cold between them, while she laid out the subcommittee's scope, and he asked genuine questions, and she answered with the full, unedited precision of a woman who is no longer deciding how much of herself to offer. They stayed there past the time when either of them would normally have returned to their separate work, and neither of them mentioned it, and the afternoon darkened around them, without either of them choosing to light a lamp until they had to. That evening they dined together, and he told her something about his own early years, something he rarely told anyone. A story from the first year of inheriting the dukedom, when he had been 22 and entirely unqualified for the weight of it, and had been too proud to admit to anyone how frightened he was. She listened. She did not offer comfort in the careful, managed way she had once offered everything. She simply listened, and when he finished, she said, "I wish I had known that. I wish you had told me that 2 years ago. I did not know how to tell it." "No." She looked at him with something that was unmistakably tender. "We have both been very bad at telling each other things. We are getting better. We are." She lifted her wineglass. "We are getting better." The new year turned at Ravensmere Court, and the snow came down over Yorkshire, and in the study, the estate papers accumulated their usual weight, and in the morning room, the Pembury correspondents sat beside the household ledgers, and in the long gallery, the portraits of previous Dukes of Ravensmere looked down at the present Duke and his Duchess as they passed through together, not side by side, in the formal parallel way of two people performing a marriage, but close, and occasionally talking. And once, just once, when they passed the end of the gallery, where the light was best, he stopped, and she stopped, and he took her face in his hands, and she let him, and he said, "I see you." She looked up at him with the clear, unguarded eyes of the woman she actually was, and she said, "I know you do." And she meant it. That was the thing about Arabella Wycliffe, Duchess of Ravensmere. She did not say things she did not mean, and she did not give what had not been earned, and she did not open doors from the outside, or stand in rooms she had outgrown, or wait for someone to notice the champagne she had set down on a window ledge at a ball where she had worn a dress and hoped and been invisible. She had walked out of that ball at midnight without a word of goodbye, because she had finally understood that a woman who is invisible in her own home has to become visible to herself before anyone else will learn to see her. She had done that. She had stood in the middle of her own life, in the middle of her own worth, and she had waited not for him, not with the passive, diminishing patience of a woman without options, but with the active, grounded patience of a woman who knows her value and is simply deciding whether the man in front of her is capable of rising to meet it. I had risen. Imperfectly. Slowly. With the particular grinding, honest effort of a man who had been wrong and knew it, and did not look for a faster or cleaner way through than the actual work of changing. And she had chosen him. Not because she had to. Not because of the title, or the obligation, or the expectation of family and society, and the Yorkshire countryside. She had chosen him because he had finally completely become someone worth choosing. That was the only kind of return that meant anything. Not a return to what they had not been enough, and they both knew it, but a beginning clear-eyed and deliberate of something that had the honest possibility of being extraordinary. The champagne on the window ledge had been left behind a long time ago. What remained in its place was something